From our studios in Tokyo, this is NHK Newsline. I'm Ross Mihara. In Washington, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has announced that the country is pulling out of the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. The Arms Control Treaty is widely considered one of the most important pacts between the U.S. and Russia.
Russia's violation puts millions of Europeans and Americans at greater risk. It aims to put the United States at a military disadvantage, and it undercuts the chances of moving our bilateral relationship in a better direction. It's our duty to respond appropriately. The United States will therefore suspend its obligations under the INF Treaty effective February 2nd. We will provide Russia and the other treaty parties with formal notice that the United States is withdrawing from the INF Treaty effective in 6 months, pursuant to Article 15 of the treaty.
Pompeo accused Russia of violating the treaty, citing the range of a new Russian cruise missile. Russia denies any violation. Once the U.S. formally notifies Russia, the pact will expire in 6 months, unless negotiations can salvage the agreement. The INF Treaty was signed in 1987 by U.S. President Ronald Reagan and Soviet Union leader Mikhail Gorbachev. It prohibits the possession, production, and flight testing of ground-launched intermediate-range ballistic and cruise missiles. Nearly 2,700 missiles were eliminated on both sides, easing tensions and contributing to the end of the Cold War. Over the past 5 years, the U.S. has been calling on Moscow to comply with the pact, but officials have failed to bridge their differences. Moscow has said the U.S. is making the accusations as an excuse to pull out. Russia has yet to comment on Washington's decision, but is expected to respond sharply. Before the announcement, Japan's foreign minister had this to say about the situation.
I can understand what's led the United States to consider suspending its obligations under the treaty. I also understand Washington's concerns leading to the decision. But it is not desirable for the world if the pact comes to an end.
Taro Kono said Japan would help create a new framework for disarmament by working not only with the U.S. and Russia, but with China and other countries as well.
The U.S. says that it will withdraw from a key arms control treaty. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced the U.S. will suspend its compliance with the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty with Russia tomorrow, Saturday, and withdraw from the accord in 6 months if Moscow does not end alleged violations of the pact. Now, the U.S. and the Soviet Union signed the INF Treaty back in 1987. Now, the U.S. says that a new generation of Russian cruise missiles breaches the terms of that pact. Here's what the U.S. Secretary of State had to say a short while ago.
Russia's violation puts millions of Europeans and Americans at greater risk. It aims to put the United States at a military disadvantage, and it undercuts the chances of moving our bilateral relationship in a better direction. It's our duty to respond appropriately. When an agreement is so brazenly disregarded and our security is so openly threatened, we must respond.
Let's get more now on that announcement. We are joined by our very own Alexander von Namen, who is standing by in Washington, D.C. So let's talk a little bit more about that, Alexander, because, you know, we heard that the U.S. will exit the treaty in 6 months, according to that plan. Is there room to salvage the deal in the meantime?
Not really. It is true that Secretary Pompeo said today that the U.S. is hopeful that Russia will return into compliance with this treaty and that the U.S. is willing to continue talks with the Russians. However, we have to say that it's very likely that an agreement can be found within this short period of time for 2 reasons. First of all, the U.S. has been complaining about Russia's violation of this treaty for years now, and the Trump administration has recently tried to increase the pressure on Russia with a mix of diplomacy and sanctions, but nothing happened. So it is rather unlikely that Russia is going to change its behavior. And the second reason is that we have to consider who is now the U.S. National Security Advisor. It is John Bolton, who is known for his skepticism and criticism of nuclear arms control treaties. And at the moment, he seems to have the president's ear.
And we're seeing that hawkish approach to policy playing out. Pompeo, meantime, saying that Russia's missile program, that it puts millions of Europeans at risk. What is Moscow's capacity, according to Washington?
Well, we're talking here about one particular missile system. It's 9M729. And according to Western officials, Russia has been accused of having deployed 4 battalions equipped with this missile system. So it's quite a number. All in all, Russia is said to have nearly 100 of these missiles. And that is why the U.S. is now saying Russia is not complying with this treaty. Why should we be the only ones bound by this treaty? The other thing we have to add here is China, of course. A senior administration official told us today that the U.S. believes that China has 1,000 of these missiles, and China is, of course, not restricted at all by any treaty now.
Alexander von Namen in Washington, thank you.
The United States is following through on its threat to pull out of a key nuclear treaty with Russia. It says Moscow has 6 months to put new cruise missiles up for inspection. Otherwise, it'll walk away for good. Russia denies violations, calls it all an excuse. European nations worry the dispute will signal the return of the intermediate-range missile buildup we witnessed in the 1980s in this continent before the end of the Cold War. Mike Pompeo says that the decision to walk away is justified.
The United States will therefore suspend its obligations under the INF Treaty effective February 2nd. We will provide Russia and the other treaty parties with formal notice that the United States is withdrawing from the INF Treaty effective in 6 months, pursuant to Article 15 of the treaty. Russia has jeopardized the United States' security interest, and we can no longer be restricted by the treaty while Russia shamelessly violates it.
For more, we turn to our own Douglas Herbert.
Evening.
Doug, it sounds like actually neither Washington nor Moscow like this treaty very much.
No, you know, well, they would probably say, if you in private, if not in public, that it's sort of irrelevant in the new multilateral world that we live in today. It was signed in a very different era, and it was a big deal. I mean, when it was signed by Reagan and Gorbachev in '87, it was like the cornerstone, the benchmark treaty of the Cold War. It was the first treaty that eliminated an entire category of nuclear weapons, reduced nuclear arsenals. Remember, both the Soviet Union back then and the U.S. had tons of missiles deployed in Europe and in the then Warsaw Pact countries. They were all over the place. They'd spurred lots of protests, especially in Germany in the mid-'80s. This was a giant issue. So the world, a lot of people were really applauding when these two leaders signed this. It's become irrelevant in the sense that, despite what Washington says about Moscow's violations, this has been a long-standing accusation. It's true. Moscow has violated the pact. There are also concerns that there's another player in town. It's China. China's up and coming. China was never a signatory to the treaty because it was only sort of a two-superpower world back then. China has, since its small, then unsophisticated military, has developed new weapons. And look, this will, if you want to be cynical about it, will free, you talked about an arms race, will free both the U.S. and Russia to potentially develop weapons to counter the Chinese threat.
Right, so if you really want to do a proper treaty, you need a multilateral treaty. Donald
Yes.
Trump doesn't do multilateral, though.
Donald Trump doesn't really, some would say he doesn't do foreign policy. What he does is he does transactional business deals with foreign powers. And in this case, I mean, you could see perhaps John Bolton, National Security Advisors, his signature written all over this. I don't really see Donald Trump sitting and coming up with this deal, and you could see a little bit of the writing on the wall in an interview that he gave to the New York Times yesterday, which grabbed a lot of headlines back in the U.S. And one of the sort of the features of this interview was they asked him. He scoffed at the notion. He was asked by the reporters in the Oval Office, the New York Times reporter sitting there. Aren't you really just in this for the money? Isn't this a money-making venture for you, the presidency? He scoffed at that. He said that being president was actually a losing proposition financially. He says, biggest loser job of all time. No, it's nothing about the money. But you sort of had a sense of in Donald Trump's mind that money is very much on his mind. Transactions are on his mind. Business is on his mind. And what? You were going to ask me something.
I was going to ask you that, and that brings us back to Russia, because one of the premises of this whole 2016 Russian meddling in the campaign investigation is that perhaps Donald Trump wanted to do business with
Vladimir Putin.
With private business, transactional business money-making business with Russia. Here we have the U.S. Basically showing
being tough on Russia.
Bad
cop. I was talking about John Bolton before. We saw Mike Pompeo. These are the so-called hawks in his administration. John Bolton has never seen a treaty he likes. He does not like international treaties. The impulse of Donald Trump, you're absolutely right, has been to not exert, to put it mildly, external pressure on Vladimir Putin, to go mildly on Putin, to resist the sanctions on Putin. And he's had these hardline advisors sort of whispering, and not so softly, in his ear, you got to get tougher on this guy. There's also obviously a political element in all of this. You have the Democrats entering the race. You have the makings of the beginning of a primary season. Donald Trump is already getting into campaign mode. He has these investigations ongoing. It perhaps couldn't hurt. You could hear an advisor telling him it couldn't hurt to look like he's being tough on Russia. And I'll just mention one more thing. We're a few days out from the State of the Union address. He signaled in this same interview, and it's worth mentioning, that he is practically given up negotiating with the Congress, especially the Democrats in Congress, on this wall. He seems to, as of now, he says, I'm building that wall, I'm going to build that wall, I'm going ahead with it. Seems like a pretty firm signal a few days out from this State of the Union. The U.S. may be headed, if not for a second shutdown, for emergency powers invoked for a president in order to implement a campaign promise over the backs of Congress. That's never been done before in U.S. history.
Douglas Herbert, many.
Welcome to the program. Our top story this hour. The U.S. has announced it's suspending its involvement in a decades-old nuclear missile pact with Russia. The Trump administration has accused Moscow of violating the treaty and says it will end the agreement in 6 months unless Russia complies with the terms of the deal. Kimberly Halkett has our report now from Washington.
Suspension of the historic treaty that has been a cornerstone of European security for decades.
For years, Russia has violated the terms of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty without remorse. The United States will therefore suspend its obligations under the INF Treaty effective February 2nd.
The White House maintains the U.S. has adhered to the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, while Russia has not. In that time, it accuses Russia of covertly developing and fielding a prohibited missile system that poses a threat to European allies and U.S. forces stationed there. The U.S. did not give specific examples of violations. Russia has consistently denied it's breaking the agreement.
The U.S. Secretary of State says that Russia is in violation. What's your response to that?
We're not. And we proved this many times, but they don't want to listen.
The agreement was signed during the Cold War by U.S. President Ronald Reagan and Russia's Mikhail Gorbachev in 1987. While most agree it's not perfect, it did halt an escalating arms race between the two superpowers. Still, U.S. President Donald Trump has long been a critic of the treaty. In October, he took a hard line, presumably to deter Russia from expanding its arsenal.
Russia has violated the agreement. They've been violating it for many years, and I don't know why President Obama didn't negotiate or pull out. And we're not going to let them violate a nuclear agreement and go out and do weapons, and we're not allowed to.
Still, there's concern the U.S. did not exhaust its diplomatic options. And as Trump pressures North Korea to give up its nuclear arsenal, many question why he would relax any missile restrictions on Russia.
It actually opens the door for Russia to deploy more of these missiles, and it opens the door for a new European missile race.
Some analysts have speculated the Trump administration isn't just worried about Russia. China is not bound by the treaty. There's criticism it's been gaining military advantage, deploying large numbers of missiles with ranges beyond the current limits.
There are now just 6 months for the agreement to be saved. The United States says Russia must destroy equipment in violation of the agreement, or it will move ahead with a response designed to deny what the United States perceives to be Russia's military advantage. Kimberly Halkett, Al Jazeera, the White House.
Well, Alan Fisher is live for us now in Washington. They might have decided to withdraw from the INF treaty, Alan, but President Trump has sounded perhaps a more positive note in the last hour or so.
Well, he says he would like to renegotiate the treaty. I don't think that's anything remarkably new. Certainly the United States has been worried about what Russia's been doing for some considerable time. The Obama administration certainly voiced their concerns, as Donald Trump said in that report by Kimberly. Donald Trump thought that Barack Obama's administration should have done a lot more and confronted the Russians about it. What Donald Trump has said is that he would like to see other nations get involved. That's certainly a nod towards China, because when this agreement was drawn up in 1987, they were by no means a significant power, and they've grown militarily in the Asia-Pacific region, certainly over the last 20 years or so. So that gives the Americans cause for concern there. And he said he would like to get into a big, beautiful room and come up with a new treaty. Certainly appeals to Donald Trump's idea of big, beautiful rooms and being the savior of the United States by signing a deal of this kind. Is there room for manoeuvre here? Well, certainly if you take the stances of both Mike Pompeo and Sergei Lavrov, there doesn't seem to be much room for compromise. The Americans are saying very starkly that they believe the Russians are in clear breach of this agreement. Sergei Lavrov saying, no, we're not. Now, there is this 6-month period. That's in the treaty. If you're going to pull out and you trigger withdrawal, then there's a 6-month period before you're actually fully out. Perhaps there is the possibility of some sort of negotiation. But as I say, if you look at the stances both governments are taking, both privately and publicly at the moment, that doesn't seem to be on the cards.
And interesting, one of the points Kimberly was making in her report there, that the Trump administration is concerned about China's missile capabilities.
Exactly. As I say, they weren't a power in 1987. It wasn't a consideration for the Ronald Reagan government at that point. It was all about dealing with the nuclear threat in Europe. Russia was the main opponent. They didn't want to get involved in an arms race, and that is why they came up with this deal. In the 20 years since, we've seen China grow militarily in the Asia-Pacific region. The United States would certainly like to move nuclear missiles into Guam if they can't get China to sign an agreement. That would give them, they feel, some sort of protection, and it would certainly be, they couldn't do that at the moment because that would be a breach of the INF deal. So that is something that the Americans might be looking at, although they're not really in a position to do that right at this moment because they simply don't have the weapons to do it. So that is why there will be pressure on all sides to come to some sort of agreement sooner rather than later, even though, as I say, there'd be nothing in it for the Chinese. The Russians aren't terribly keen, and the United States is taking a very hard line.
Thank you very much for now. Alan Fisher in Washington.